Hero or villain? Discoverer or destroyer? Few names spark as much controversy in today's society than Christopher Columbus. And as we get ready for Columbus Day, or should we be saying Indigenous Peoples Day, we are going to sit down and try to separate fact from fiction with historian Rafael Ortiz, who is a modern expert on the life of Christopher Columbus. So strap on your seatbelt and get ready to learn what the real story of Christopher Columbus is about. Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to this edition of Creating the Future, where we dive into stories and truths and deep questions that help you shape our families, our faith, and of course, our future. Now, today we are on the cusp of Columbus Day. That'll be this coming Monday. And because of that, I thought, what a great time to discuss one of the more hotly debated people throughout history, Christopher Columbus himself. And so we're going to talk about it today. Was he a hero? Was he a villain? Or was he something in between? And to help us in the middle of this controversy, I am joined by Mr. Rafael Ortiz, the author, the researcher, and one of the leading voices on Christopher Columbus himself, and really fighting against what he would refer to as modern revisionism. Rafael has written multiple books on Columbus, including Christopher Columbus, the Hero, and its sequel, which digs into the accusations and historical records surrounding the explorer. Who was he really? Now, as we approach this Columbus Day, let's jump into the real story. Let's move beyond the politics, the myths, all the headlines that'll come out, and try to figure out who was Columbus really. What did he accomplish? What mistakes did he make? What did he do really well? And what is his legacy to this day? So with that being said, Rafael, welcome onto the show today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, really excited that you are here. So let's just start right off the bat, right in the beginning. Rafael, tell us a little bit about your background and what drew you to start researching and studying Christopher Columbus.
Usually the people who defend Columbus are Italian Americans,
Yeah.
or Catholics, and I am not a Catholic and I am not Italian American, so that's why they like me. And I'm Hispanic. I was born in Puerto Rico,
Mm-hmm.
and what caused me to investigate was the fact that I thought that Columbus was a good man, especially with the Indians, because I was born in Puerto Rico, which is one of the lands that he discovered during the
Yeah.
second voyage in 1493.
Mm-hmm.
And we are descendants of the Taínos too. We are mixed. We are half indigenous too. So I was very curious. I started to investigate, and I found out from the get-go that everything was false.
Mm.
In other words, that not in other words, not every indigenous person is against Columbus, because they're trying to rename Columbus Day as Indigenous Peoples Day.
Right.
But I'm half indigenous, and against that. We're not against Indigenous Peoples Day anyway, because most people don't know this, but there are already like 2 Indigenous Peoples Day on the calendar.
Mm.
So there is no need to rename Columbus Day. One is
Yeah.
called the International Indigenous Peoples Day, and the other one is Native American Heritage Day, which is celebrated on the Friday after Thanksgiving Day, and also November is Indigenous Peoples Month.
Mm-hmm.
So the people who are trying to do this, they're just trying to divide, put people against each other: white versus black, Indigenous versus Native American, Indigenous versus Italian Americans. So that's one of the reasons why they like me too.
Right, right. So this coming Monday's Columbus Day, we would call it, some would refer to it as Indigenous Peoples Day. You're saying there's already multiple Indigenous Peoples Day. So you started getting interested in the subject of Christopher Columbus, though, because you're Puerto Rican, and that's one of the places he discovered. You're a Tano person from background. That's one of the people, we'll get to this in a minute, so you don't have to answer it yet, but that's one of the people that some would say that Christopher Columbus enslaved some of them, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But let's just start. All right, so we heard a little bit of your story. Let's start with the beginning of Christopher Columbus's story. Who was he? What was his purpose? How did he find this new land? Why did he find this new land? What was going on in Columbus's day that sent him across the Atlantic?
Christopher Columbus, his name Cristoforo Colombo. He was born in Genoa, Italy, 1451, and then he changed his name to Cristobal Colon once he started to work with Spain. And one of his main purposes, most people know that he was trying to find a shorter route to the Indies,
Hmm.
but most people don't know that he one of his main purposes was to bring the gospel of Jesus
Right.
Christ. And everybody who has studied him, they know that he was a very that he was a Christian. He was
Hmm.
very serious about his faith,
Hmm.
and I believe that's one of the reasons why he's been uh, misaccused, yeah,
Yeah.
accusedly, he's falsely been accused. So and he believed he believed that he had that mission from God,
Right.
that it was not an accident that his name was Christopher, which means the Christ bearer.
Mm.
He believed that he was, the Bible says once the gospel is preached, then Jesus will come. So he believed that he had a part on it, that he was
Yeah.
fulfilling prophecies
Right.
about reaching new lands. And he even wrote several letters called they call it now the book of prophecies, where
Hmm.
he talking about Bible prophecy and stuff like that. So some people think that when they hear the word Indies, they think that he was looking for India, but that's not true. India is part of the Indies. Indies was just the name of Asia, which included China and Japan. Back
Right.
then, names were different. So they say that he was ignorant, that he should have known that he was in a different land, which is not true because nobody knew that there was a continent in between Asia and Europe. So that's why we say that he discovered America. It doesn't mean that he was the
Right.
first European or the first human being. It's just America was not on the maps until he found it, and then others start to discover more lands. So also he made 4 voyages too. It was not just one, and he reached, if not all, the Caribbean, maybe most of it, and also South America and Central America. Because most people
Right.
think, oh, he never reached the continent. No, he actually reached the continent, and then he's accused of, well, but he never reached North America. And I say, well, but North America was reached because of him, because then the English came here. Also, Juan Ponce de Leon, who came with him
Right.
on the second voyage, he discovered Florida, which is part of North America.
Right.
And I find also the people that Amerigo Vespucci, he never reached North America either, even
Hmm.
though it's named America
Hmm.
after him. And
Right.
also Amerigo Vespucci, he reached later, after Columbus reached the continent first, by using a map Columbus himself made.
Hmm. Wow.
But most people don't know this.
Right. Right. Yeah, well, there was no North and South America, Central America. It was just the Americas at that time. He
Mhm.
discovered a whole new region that to the west was completely unheard of at that time to Europe in their maps. So I'm curious about this. So I've heard stories personally over the years. Columbus had a spiritual encounter, and we know that when you look at history, there's oftentimes a working together with missionaries where they're being paid by a government to do a certain cause, but then the missionary has a cause alongside of it. And so the two kind of cooperate together. And so while we would say he brought Christianity and saw that as a purpose individually, you also see here that the government's going to have a different purpose. And the two of those are going to combine without any doubt. We're talking 1492, so the Reformation has not even happened yet. So the version of Christianity would be a good bit different than what a lot of people would see today in the Protestant world at the minimum. But I've heard that Columbus had some kind of spiritual encounter. If I remember the story correctly, it was one of those where he was on a ship and had some sort of, they thought the ship was going to go under, cried out to God. God, seemed to save them, and he sort of gave his life and the rest of his life to the mission of spreading the gospel. Is there any accuracy to that, or is that just something I heard somewhere?
Uh, he was already a believer when he started.
Right.
And there were many times on the story that it was like that, where they thought they're not gonna make it, and then God show up.
Hmm.
And you will see that a lot on his letters, on his journals, and also on the biography by his son. They say, "But God."
Hmm.
but God. They were going to die on the storm,
Yeah.
or hurricane, but
Right.
God showed up, and they saved.
Yeah.
I mean, and then God saved them.
Yeah.
He also named many places after something related to the Bible. Like Puerto Rico, the original name is actually San Juan, which is Saint John the Baptist,
Hmm.
and Trinidad, which is the Trinity. Many other places were named after that. Something related, San Salvador, which is the first island that means Holy Savior. So yeah, he was, into Jesus.
Yeah, it's clear there. I think many of us, we might be saved, we might be followers of Jesus, but you have these encounters, these special moments that then kind of drive it home. Sometimes that could be fear, and you're going, all right, from this day forward, my mission is to advance the gospel. All right. So let's switch. You just kind of mentioned the journals and the documents. I think this is important to understand. When you go back in history, we don't just want to read what the historians are saying. If possible in history, you want the original documents. In this case, the documents of Columbus, his friends, his colleagues, those reports, those commentaries. When you go back for your books, and what are you going back to those original reports, and what are they saying about Christopher Columbus?
So that's the first thing that I did.
Mhm.
I saw online on social media that they were saying Columbus was a murderer, a rapist, a pedophile, a genocidal maniac. So I was, wow, I never heard anything like that. So I went to my public library and I got his journal from the first voyage, meaning that you can find these books for free.
Yeah.
And most of my books are online. They are ebooks.
Hmm.
Some you have to buy though, but they are there. And he had a journal, and then he had letters, and they were all for the eyes of the queen only. So he's not doing this like writing his own biography.
Right.
And so that's the first source. Then I read Peter Morter, who was in Spanish Pedro Martir. He also was a friend, and he also wrote letters, and also they were private. So those two are very important because
Hmm.
later, when they were made public, there is no contradiction.
Right.
The first public, I believe, biography was by Oviedo, Gonzalo de Oviedo, and that was decades later. And then his son, Columbus's son, Fernando, or Ferdinand Columbus, he wrote, because he was trying to correct some mistakes made by Oviedo. He came much later, and also he accompanied his father on the fourth voyage. So it's almost like the Bible. You have Luke, Mark, John, and Matthew. They are the primary source for Jesus.
Right.
One brings, something that the other one don't say. So everything is almost like a puzzle.
Hmm.
I mean, it brings more context, and the same, So everything that they say in private also was confirmed later in public.
Yeah.
So I read all those sources, everything that, because I didn't want to defend somebody that maybe perhaps he was doing something bad. I wanted
Right.
to
Right.
be sure, and that's why I read. And also, Spanish is my mother language.
Hmm.
My Spanish still better than my English,
Yeah.
so I read everything that I could just to make sure. And I was, it's true. He was a good man. Even letters, private letters that have nothing to do with anything, and they all say the same thing. So I found out that all these things, because he was a hero for almost 500 years. So
Right.
all these things are very recent, just for the last few decades.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, so let me ask this. So frequently when we look at historical figures, or honestly any figures, I think in some regards we're seeing this right now in the United States, we tend to either, I would say, deify someone or crucify them, right? We either try to turn them into a god like they were perfect, they never did anything wrong, or we crucify them because they are the devil themselves, they're the worst person ever. And like with every human being that has ever existed, the truth is somewhere in between there. They're not the devil and they're also not Christ, right? And so when it comes to Columbus, it seems like there's a push right now to crucifying him as if he is a bad person and did all these evil things. And certainly he's going to end up somewhere in the middle. So when modern critics cite the cruelties, the abuses, the wrongdoings, all those things that they say he did, how much of that is true? And we'll get to this in a minute. How much of that was maybe the common customs of the time period, with the enslavement of people, I'm curious about the story of the genocide of people. I've heard my version of that, of what I've heard that is. So how much of that is true? Because he's not a perfect human being, but some of it is just the time period and the different standards of morality at that time period.
None of those accusations are true, meaning that he was a racist or a murderer, genocidal maniac. And when you look into those accusations, some of them they don't even make any sense.
Hmm.
Because how can you be a racist and bring the gospel to people of a different skin?
Hmm.
And the union of Spaniards and Indians, that's what brought forth Hispanics.
Yeah.
And it's impossible for one man to commit so much genocide. Just one guy, really, he killed everybody. And so the source for all this misinformation, there are several people, but the most famous, his name was Howard Zinn.
Hmm.
And he was not somebody who met Columbus. He's just a guy who lived, in the 20th century. He was a self-proclaimed anarchist. He wrote this book that became very influential, and he had many followers and imitators, and there are other people too, like James Lowen, and I mentioned some others in my book. What they all have in common is that none of them met Columbus. None of them were primary sources. Some of their politics, they are kind of anti-American, anti-Christian.
Hmm.
In the case of Howard Zinn, I read what he said about Columbus, and then I compare notes with the actual primary sources, and that's when I started to see that they were lying about many things, saying they were saying things that Columbus said that he never said,
Hmm.
or they would distort some of the things that he said,
Right.
or they were talking about things that actually did happen, abuses that happened in the back then, but it was not Columbus because he was not even alive at the time.
Right.
One There is a primary source. His name was Bartolome de las Casas, and he wrote some. He was a defender of the Indians because yes, there were people who abused Indians over there back then, and he wrote this short book called "A Short Account on the Destruction of the Indies."
Hmm.
And there is a lot of atrocities in that book about murder, rape, and things like that. But and that's when you hear most of these accusations, like people dying. But the book is not about Columbus. Columbus was dead,
Right.
and many of the places are places that Columbus never reached.
Hmm.
And so when you hear some of those quotes, it's not even about Columbus.
Right.
They're using a different timeline,
Hmm.
and the only accusation, which was not fair either, made by Bartolome de las Casas, was what he called uh, unjust wars.
Mm.
That's it.
Mm.
Because even though he was a priest, he was not a peacenik. You have to
Okay.
remember Spain was fighting the Muslims back then
Mm.
with the Reconquista. They conquered back Granada. You have to remember that when Muhammad came, he took all the land that was Christian and he made them into Muslims except for Europe.
Hmm.
So they were fighting. So he was not a peacenik.
Mm.
So he was not against war. He was just against unjust war. So
Mm.
most of the time, most of the so-called slavery was uh, what we call today prisoners of war.
Hmm.
So if the war was just, then the prisoners or slaves that was justified.
Right.
So he was in favor in the beginning, but then later he changed.
Hmm.
So that's the only thing that he was against Columbus. But he himself said that Columbus was a hero. He himself said that Columbus was a man of God. He
Hmm.
said that what he did was the greatest accomplishment, and he was not the only one though. There were several people that said the same thing, that what Columbus accomplished was the greatest event in history after the crucifixion of Jesus.
Mm.
And it's not accident that his name is Christopher, like Christ. Jesus divided the history between
Hmm.
before Christ and after Christ, and
Hmm.
Columbus divided history too. Like
Oh,
the
yeah.
pre-Columbian era and the Columbian era, he divided the world, the New World and the
Hmm.
Old World, the New
Hmm.
Testament, the Old Testament. There is not, I
Right.
mean,
Right.
so
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, at the very minimum, one of the few things I remember from school back in the day was in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. I think many of us can relate to that.
Mhm.
All right, so let's quickly look at this. So you mentioned the word distort or distortion right there. I think personally, it's very natural for us when we look at any historical figure, especially from as far away as 500 years ago and beyond, that we naturally, without realizing it, we often put today's moral codes on people back then. And it was a very different world, and it's not fair to do that. And if you do that, then virtually everybody is going to be looked at as evil because the world was just a different place back then. You can't do that. It's not a healthy way of looking at history. And so you're looking at people who were actually trying to do things right, and whether they were always right or not, that's not the point. So there's a distortion there that happens. I'm curious about the genocide story because I remember reading about it number of years ago, because just studying on Columbus myself and trying to learn about Columbus. And as I understood the story, the genocide story comes from a tribe that was cannibals that were terrorizing the other local tribes in that area. And the other local tribes were actually wanting Columbus to get rid of this cannibal tribe because they were causing such destruction and such problems. And so he went out and with his small army, his because he had the muskets and the things they wouldn't have had at the time, he had better equipment, and took out that group of people. But it wasn't for a bad reason. It wasn't because he was trying to commit genocide. It's because you have a group of people that's terrorizing everybody else, and he essentially becomes law enforcement for the others. Can you speak to that? Is that accurate? Is that inaccurate? Maybe I don't remember the story correctly, but can you speak?
Uh, some things are and some things are not. So,
Mhm.
uh, yes, Columbus made a treaty with the Taínos
Mhm.
because they were victims of the Caribs, and the Caribs were a tribe of cannibals, and that's where the word cannibal comes from. It's come from Caribe or Caribbean, the Caribbean Sea. That word evolved into cannibal. And yes, they were terrorizing, they were killing, they were raping, they even commit the genocide of entire islands before Columbus got there. And so Columbus made a treaty and that he was going to get rid of them, but not in that sense though. So what he did on the second voyage, he started to destroy their canoes, so to keep them from keep terrorizing. And then he took some of them and he sent some of them to Spain as prisoners of war. And that's it. There
Mhm.
was no killing, maybe one or two, but then the war that happened, it was during the second voyage, and that was just a few months for it, just a few months, because when he returned back, all his men were dead.
Mhm.
But they investigated and they found out who was behind that, and he decided not to do anything. He just went to another part of the island,
Mhm.
Hispaniola, and
Right.
he settled there, and he tried to do everything that he could to keep peace. He was a man of peace. He was not, the few times that he used force was the last resort, and that was not only with the indigenous but also with the Spaniards, because later there was mutiny and they put him in jail, and that's why I wrote my last book, which is called Christopher Columbus the Hero Part Two. And so he didn't use any force until he was asked by one of his allies to help him fight his enemies,
Mhm.
because one of them took one of his wife, because back then the chiefs were polygamous,
Mhm.
and he killed another one. So he agreed because it was the same guy who also was killing Spaniards. So
Mhm.
he fought them, but it was a quick war, and he sent some back to Spain again as prisoners of war. And that's it. That's the story. So the real genocide happened much later, when after Columbus was out of office. The person who came to Hispaniola, he was very cruel, and he did some cruelties. Everybody condemned that. And also after Columbus died and the queen died, because as I said, the prisoners of war thing, that was the quote unquote slavery that was allowed.
Yeah, that's what I
But
was
then,
about to ask. Yeah.
yes, but the queen suspended during the third voyage of Columbus. It was suspended.
Mm.
It was later brought back as the what is called today the encomiendas, because on paper it's not slavery. It was just the Spaniards serving the Indians as their security in
Right.
exchange for them for labor on the land, farming
Mhm.
the land.
Mhm.
But what they were doing, it was really slavery and abuse, but nobody was there to see and report.
Yeah.
And the one who had done reporting in the past was Columbus.
Hmm.
That's why he punished the colonists. That's why
Hmm.
he got in trouble with them.
Hmm.
That's why I also call him a hero, because he's the one who was defending the Taínos. And so, but then the priests, that's the ones who became the heroes, because then they started to report to the king what was happening.
Hmm.
So every historian of the time, they say what happened, and it was very embarrassing that many of these people they die, most
Yeah.
of them on the Caribbean.
Yeah.
So that's why you don't see a lot of brown people in the Caribbean, unless it's mixed people like me in Puerto Rico and Cuba and the Dominican Republic. So that's what happened.
Yeah.
But that was not Columbus. That was much later, and then they
Right.
suspended the whole thing.
Yeah. 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 That's something else
But
I.
prior to that, but let me tell you this. So
Mhm.
they're trying to use that as propaganda to embarrass the Europeans, because they're the ones who broke Christianity. So they're trying to portray Christianity as bad. But it's the Christian who reform and abolish. So if we're gonna be fair, they were doing the same thing. The Indians, and by the standards of the day, they were doing worse.
Right. Right.
Again, they committed genocide among each other.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, the Aztecs, the Incas, they sacrificed thousands upon thousands of people to their false gods.
Hmm.
And it was the Spaniards who canceled that kind of thing.
Right.
And also, the history in general have been told very wrong when it comes to the history of the Europeans when they came, because they're trying to portray them as people who came here to take the land and steal the land. No, they were actually fighting with the Indians to conquer other Indians.
Right.
Like that's what they did with Montezuma.
Right.
Hernan Cortez, he won because the Indians they were against their own emperor, who
Yeah.
was cruel, Montezuma. That's the way that they defeated
Yeah.
him.
Yeah. 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 That's so good. Um, I've heard it said this way, and I've never researched this to know it as a fact for sure, but I heard one historian one time say that every single culture of the world had some sort of human sacrifice involved in it until
Yeah.
Christianity reached it. And
Yes.
I think that's a very interesting thought. All right, so you said something that I've seen in my studies as well, that while Columbus was there, while he was governing and managing things, it was much healthier. And so he gets a bad rap for the moments he left. And it's kind of like, when the cat's away, the mouse will play. When he leaves, chaos ensues sometimes, but that's not on Columbus, that's on the people that were there. And some people try to say, well, he paved the way. He started it, but he wasn't there. You can't really hold him accountable to that. How would you approach historical figures more broadly, not just Columbus, but anybody when we hear these? Because Columbus is not the only historical figure that's getting a bad rap nowadays, because there is this revisionist history that goes on, and we're trying to kind of make villains out of our heroes in a lot of regards. What advice would you give any of our listeners who hear those kind of things, and maybe they grew up, I don't know, hearing this person was a hero in the school, and then later on you find out, no, he was a bad person. What advice would you give them?
Well, before I say an advice, the history of the colonization and conquest, Spanish conquest, and then later the British and stuff, but also Christian history from the times of the Roman Empire when they became Christians. I can compare it to the Book of Kings and to the Book of Judges.
Mm.
If you read Judges, that's almost the story of many of the conquistadors.
Hmm.
Some were good, some were bad.
Yeah.
And the same with Christian history with the kings
Right.
after Constantine. They were good kings, they were bad kings who were Christians.
Right.
Because we are not perfect. Even in the Bible, you see kings who were supposed to be from God killing the opposition.
Right.
So, and that's what people were doing back then too.
Right.
So, I'll say, maybe be a skeptic and research, go to
Mhm.
primary sources and read. I knew that this was not about Columbus. I knew they were going to start with him and then move to other things, because
Mhm.
then later I saw that they were trying to rename Thanksgiving as on Thanksgiving Day.
Right.
But they fail, because most people they see Thanksgiving as part of Christmas, in my opinion. Plus,
Hmm.
also they spoke English.
Hmm.
So and they did the same in the 2020. They start to say things, or actually 2020, 2017, They start to accuse the same about George Washington because he had slaves, and they say things
Right.
about the Constitution and the American flag. I talk about all that on my second book, which is called
Mhm.
Columbus Day versus Indigenous Peoples Day. I have 5 books.
Mhm.
And if I can tell them quick, Columbus
Yeah,
the hero
please.
is the first one, Christopher Columbus the hero, and then you have Columbus Day versus Indigenous Peoples Day, which talks about all those things, what happened after Columbus, about the Pilgrims, Thanksgiving, George Washington, Lincoln. Then I have a book. It's called Christopher Columbus and the Christian Church. And I say on the beginning of that book, do not, if you're not a Christian, do not read this book, because I am a Christian and I wrote that book as a Christian, because everybody says, yeah, Columbus was a Christian, but they see him as somebody who mean well, but they are not Christians. That's why they see him
Mhm.
as that. I believe what he believed. I believe in Jesus. I believe in the second coming of Christ.
Yeah.
I believe there was a paradise, which he mentions too in one of his letters.
Mhm.
So that's why I wrote that book. And also it tells a story, because most of the time they start with the pilgrims, but the pilgrims came later. It was Columbus
Right.
first, then
Right.
others. So I have all that history, a lot of testimonies, and that's miracles, signs,
Yeah.
wonders, healings. You won't believe. I mean, it's an awesome story.
Yeah.
I have a lot of fun. And then I made my first book is also in Spanish, called Cristóbal Colón de El Héroe. I
Mhm.
wrote a book that I didn't write. It's called it's this long, title, Historia Geográfica Civil Política. It's the history of Puerto Rico.
Mhm.
I republished that book. I only was the editor of that book. Christopher Columbus, the Hero, Part Two, is actually, I'm not trying to keep going with the same thing about Columbus being a hero. I'm trying to be, but I titled the Hero Part Two because if you don't know about my first book, if I name the book, for example, Christopher Columbus versus Francisco de Bobadilla,
Mm.
most people don't know who on earth was Francisco de Bobadilla.
Right.
But if I name him the Hero Part Two, then people, wait, they have a new book. But also the people who don't know about my first book, now they know, wait, there is a Hero Part One.
Right.
So that's about, he was accused and removed from office. It was mutiny. The accusations were false.
Yeah.
They wrote this dossier. It's the only English-speaking book that contains the whole thing in it, so people can see the whole thing was made up. One of my last books is Christopher Columbus, the Hero, for the children's book.
Mm.
It's for ages 6 to 9, and then I made
Yeah.
like a coloring book version, and then I wrote just now. I just released a new book. It's the only one that is not about Columbus. It's called The Myth of the Nephilim.
Mm.
But the long title, The Myth of the Nephilim, the Watchers, the Sons of God, and other distortion from the book of Genesis.
Mm.
It has nothing to do with Columbus. It's just about Genesis, the creation,
Yeah.
the book of Enoch, and
Yeah.
all that stuff.
Okay. So if people want to find those books, where do they find them at? How do they reach you?
Amazon, Amazon
Mhm.
and Kindle.
Okay. And we will put links inside the show notes for this as well. So if you would like to follow Raphael's ministry or your career, I guess ministry might not be the right word, but maybe it is. I don't know. But if they want to follow you, learn more, study Columbus or other of these historical figures, they can go to Amazon. Do you want to share your website as well?
It's called ChristopherColumbusTheHero.com.
Okay, ChristopherColumbusTheHero.com. That'll also be in the show notes. All right, Raphael, as we begin to wrap up, if you could leave with one thing for our listeners to hear today about Christopher Columbus as they prepare for Columbus Day and they're going to hear stuff on the news about how bad he is or this or that. If you could say one thing to our audience, what would it be?
People try to separate Columbus from America, but you can't. You cannot separate him from America. Even
Mm.
America is on the maps because of him. We are here because of him. If you have European blood, you are here because of him. If you are Hispanic, you are here because of him. If you're a Christian, Catholic, or Protestant, it's because of him, because he came first and others came later. The Pledge of Allegiance was made because of him. It was in the honor of Christopher Columbus. He was so heroic that a lot of places where, there is a story, and I don't have the time, about why it's America and not Columbus, but it should have been named Columbus.
Right.
But there are many places named after him, even Washington, D.C.,
Yeah.
many capitals like Canada, the British Columbia. There is even a country called Colombia after him
Mhm.
in South America. There are islands
Mhm.
named after him. So he was very important. And if you're a Christian, you owe that to him, because that was one of his missions.
Yeah. Yeah. So good. Well, Rafael, thank you so much for being with us today on the show. For all of our listeners, I hope you have enjoyed this. I hope you've learned something because this may not be a subject you've ever taken a deep dive into or thought much about, but I think it's a subject that's important because we're dealing with heroes. And on our show, we have to understand that heroes are never perfect, deities or villains. They're never heroes or villains. There's always something in the middle. And if we start pulling down all of our heroes because they weren't perfect, then you're literally going to pull down every hero we've ever had, and we all hurt when we do that. So it brings all of us down in our standards. So with that being said, again, thank you, Raphael, for being with us. If you haven't done this yet, make sure you like, subscribe, and comment. I love your comments. I love to see them every week. I read every one of them. Appreciate every one of them. If you're listening online, do me a favor and make a 5-star review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, wherever that is that you're listening. Helps other people find this content as well. And look forward to seeing you again next week on Creating the Future. God bless you.